All my life, I've had a dream that I could make something that was invisible and it would make everything around it more beautiful. It's a dream that's kept sort of a line through all the things that I've done. I've never succeeded, but it's still alive.
Do you know where this dream comes from?
I'm not really sure where the idea came from, but when I was a student, I spent an afternoon with Joseph Albers, who's a painter. And he was looking at my paintings and he said, I don't understand why we have to have frames that are on all four sides of a painting. You could have frames that are just on the sides or just on the bottom or just on the top. And I really wasn't sure what he was talking about. But something like 30 years later, I started thinking about that. And so this comment that he made is invisible, but it continued to nourish me many years after one simple little question. I think teaching is an example of where you can be invisible, because if you're a good teacher, you have to create a situation where the students think that what they're doing is their idea, even if it isn't completely their idea. That's another example, probably. I discovered a quote that Henry Moore said. He said something like, the secret of life is to have something that you want to do, that you'll do every day of your life. You'll dedicate every moment to doing it. But the most important thing is that it's something that you cannot possibly do. Somehow he had some idea that in this direction of something that changes something without touching it.
Is it the way sculpture came to you?
Most of my work came indirectly. The best metaphor I ever discovered, and I like real metaphors, not made-up ones. I once subscribed to a magazine. The magazine went out of business, and I started getting a completely different magazine on a different subject to fill out my subscription. I think when I started painting and then I began making paper in my search for ground, I had no idea when I began doing paintings that the work would take me where it did, that I was simply a passenger following it along. And the sculptures came through a process of doing one thing after another. In the beginning, I wouldn't mark on my paper. It was about something completely different. And then I started doing little drawings that were copies of some tiny little imperfection on the surface of the paper. And they started suggesting that they were depictions of something in the world, so I started making those things. So my sculptures are not completely independent. They're a realization of a depiction of something, of an implied depiction of something else.
What about the material?
In general, when I first started doing sculptures, I was living in East London and feeling quite trapped. What happens if you work long enough, you reach a point where everything you do diminishes the achievement that you've already made. And
what do you mean?
That means that if I was working on paper and things that I could do with paper, I could continue doing variations of that, but all of it diluted what the work was, the strength of the work, because it was a Baroque form of that. So I was living in East London. I was a single parent with a young child, and I was feeling trapped in a lot of different directions. That's when I started making sculptures from these drawings. And I decided that each thing I did would be out of a different material. So there were many different things. I made something from bottle caps. I lived next to a derelict cemetery. I took a bit of stone from the cemetery and carved that. I made things from clay, from plaster, from wax, from shit.
Really?
Well, I had a toilet that didn't always work, so I thought, well, I have all this stuff that I have to deal with. It never survived, but
You did it.
I did it. My only rule was that each thing I made should be in a different material.
So that was about doing something without any repetition.
That's how I got out of this trap that I felt I was in. And it worked. At some point, I made two pieces out of the same material, and the spell was broken.
What's that feeling that makes you say it worked?
Well, I was very uncomfortable with these pieces. Nigel Greenwood, who was my dealer in London, came to my studio and he saw some of them and he said, "Well, let's show these." And I said, No, I'm just doing them for myself." A couple months later, he came back and he said, "Well, let's show some of these." And I said, "No, I'm not comfortable showing them. I don't know what I'm doing." And he said, "Well, it won't be a show. We'll just put some pieces up in the office and we'll see how they look outside of your space." And I said, "Well, okay, but no invitation card." But when I saw them eventually in the space, I could understand something. I could see them in a way that I couldn't see otherwise. So Nigel was really responsible for freeing me from that. After that, I was freed and I continued pursuing those pieces.
So it speaks a lot about the influence of the space in how we can see work.
Yes, absolutely. Even if you're in your studio or in somebody else's studio, you have to have a certain point of view in order to see something. It's all about relationship. It's your relationship to the thing you're experiencing, or the relationship between different pieces that are there. It has a different relationship in the studio. It has a different relationship in the gallery. And if a piece gets sent to a museum, then it has to develop a relationship between all the other pieces in the museum. So I always think that an exhibition is a little laboratory in which you experience these relationships. Even though we think of an exhibition as a celebration of completion, it's actually just a step along the way of these pieces developing more and more relationships.
Does it mean that even the artist in his studio is unable to really see what he did?
In some cases, but you can see things with blinders on. What happens is that an artist at some time learns to look at his or her own work separate from their taste for what they like and don't like. I was lucky because when I first moved to New York, I got a job as a busboy and bartender. And I was a good bartender, but I didn't like mixed drinks. But I could tell whether I made a good Brandy Alexander or a good Singapore Sling or a good sour, even though I didn't really like them. And I thought, this is interesting. I can judge quality that's separate from my taste. And then I thought that I could do that with art as well. And there were artists whose work I didn't like, but I knew that they were good artists. There's that, but there's also something. When a painter does a painting in the studio, it's in relationship to the walls and the quality of the light that comes in. If there are trees outside, the light's slightly green. If it's an afternoon light, the light gets yellow. If the walls are white, if there are other paintings around, I think as artists we're balancing our work with the context that it's in. And it takes some discipline to push away the context. I heard that Robert Ryman has 3 kinds of light in his studio. So he tests every painting in 3 different kinds of lights so that if it goes out into the world, he's not surprised that he painted it in natural light and it's under yellow light or blue light. So there are these things where the painting or any artwork responds to the context it's in. So that's why it can look different in a gallery, and that's why we can get to know something that we thought we knew really well in a different context. Painters have classic techniques. One is to look at something in a mirror, or one technique that Albers had is to look at a painting from the side, and that makes the colors that are closer to you more dominant and the ones that are further away more recessive. And so it's easy to tell if the balance of the painting's right simply from the angle of approach. Sometimes artists will lie down on the floor and look at something, or climb up on a ladder, which is especially useful for sculptors, is to look down on something because you see things that you don't necessarily see other times. So you're always getting to know something according to the way the work behaves next to someone else.
I'm thinking of the relationship between two people. We need to meet in different contexts.
The way we relate to each other is not that different from the way we relate to an art object. It speaks in a different language, as every material does. You know, what's interesting from using different materials is that a substance is an honest teacher, an honest advisor. Some materials are hard and some are soft. Almost all have an invisible grain. There's some things that you can do with some that you can't do with the other. And there's always a conversation that happens when you start working with the material.
Conversation with silence.
Not always. When I was in charge of the carving atelier in Paris, I could tell who needed my attention just from listening to the sound of the carving. That was interesting. But each substance creates a dialogue with the craftsman who's using it. And the substances do talk about themselves a lot. So the craftsman's role is to listen more than to talk.
What is the starting point when you begin to create a new piece?
I do start slowly. The first step is me getting to know whatever is the seed or the inspiration. In some cases, that's a drawing. What's interesting about observational drawing, and which is similar to carving, like carving stone, is that in observational drawing, each line you make allows you to see something differently. And with carving, as you take some material off, you're able to see something differently. So you're clearing a kind of vision. And I try to nourish it with my attention, I suppose, to try to get something that lines up with something else. It's with most of the things that I do, they're not completely self-contained. I'm always attentive to how certain things line up with meaning or with echoes or something like that. And then it's several stages down the line that something gets closer to resolution, and it looks like it's done, and then it's very hard to get the last little bit. It's sort of like driving across the United States. When you see the Rocky Mountains, you think you're almost there, and you drive an entire day and they're just as far away, and you drive another day and they're just as far away. And so there's that kind of experience where euphoric because you think you've finally gotten there, but you haven't.
You haven't because you have no map.
Exactly. That's a very good way to put it.
So you need them to be strong enough to be able to communicate with you.
Yes, yeah. De Kooning said a painting's never finished, it's simply abandoned. I'm not quite that intent on the unfinishedness, because I do think that something's finished, because I won't exhibit something unless I think it's gotten things to a point where it's actually doing something in the space, and in the case of sculpture, where it affects the space around it. Because a sculpture doesn't end with its physical boundaries. It really draws a much larger shape in the room that it's in or in the area around it outside.
How do you feel that a piece is finished?
I recognize something there. It's hard to say what. Those seem totally contradictory, but they're both something about a recognition.
A recognition of what?
That's what I can't really say. I don't know how you recognize something you've never seen before. I was able to talk to an archaeologist, and he said the most difficult thing for archaeologists when they're doing on a dig is how they recognize something that they've never seen before. And he said that it's extremely difficult. And he had one girl who was working with him, and she noticed a tiny speck of paint on something. And that opened up a whole new area of investigation. Sometimes when you see something that is some kind of a break in the pattern that you expect, then you can see something. So the recognition aspect probably has to do with internalizing a pattern and knowing that something is either the same or different from that pattern. There's something in that direction.
While working, what guides you?
As long as I have energy and keep making lots of little discoveries, just working on things, you make these little discoveries and each one gives you energy to keep going. So what's wonderful about anything with art is that you're constantly being fed by what you're doing. If it's working well, you don't have to take energy from somewhere else to feed what you need to be doing. There is drudgery occasionally, but you have to balance the drudgery with these little epiphanies and discoveries.
Are you talking about an effortless process of creating your pieces?
No, because there's effort involved. But the nourishment are these little insights that come along. In my case, I need to be involved with stuff, with material. And it's the material that allows me to think about things. If I just sat in an empty room, my thinking process wouldn't be as fruitful. Robert Sokolovsky, who's a philosopher, has a book, and he says, thinking is not something we do entirely on our own. We're allowed to think by what our thoughts are about. In my case, I'm allowed to think by my reaction with the material world, and I trust the advice it gives me.
Tell me more about the life that the artist puts in the work.
The artist is a caretaker of the energy in the piece. I guess the artist protects something. Once there's a little spark of something, then the role is to protect that energy and nourish it if it needs it nourished. And that's probably why that last 10% of doing something is so difficult, because the work so far has sensitized us to many things that we didn't see in the beginning. So that's why we think the work is almost finished when it's 90% finished, because we think that there it is, there's a shape, not a literal silhouette, but there is something there that can be recognized. And we realize that for most people, that's all they need to see, that they won't see that extra 10%, but it's that 10% that makes a difference between whether the work is going to live or not live in some way.
In which state are you when you feel the sparkle that comes out from the work?
I'm very happy. I get happy all along. When from the first seed and something might come of it, then I get energy because I want to see something which is little and fragile and how it's going to look when it's as big as I am or, larger. And then when it rounds itself out into 3 dimensions, that's quite interesting because at that point I can walk around it and I get to know something which I couldn't see from a single view or when I was working on just one side of it. And then when I feel like I'm meeting the sculpture for the first time, that's a very interesting moment. Then I have to pay much closer attention. It's not my will making something happen. I have to listen differently. I guess we feed it by listening to it. We're always feeding something, as human beings. We're feeding some aspect of ourselves and our talents, if we have it, and our sense of attention.
Is it important for you to try to put words on your creative process like you do right now in this interview?
I don't know that it's important in that sense, but the writing is important to me because I discover things in the writing. If I've discovered things in my writing, then those things I don't mind sharing. Before we began the interview, I said my tendency is to change the subject. If people ask me about my work, I'm really good at changing the subject, and I can do it pretty quickly. In some ways, it's to avoid talking about my work. There's a story that is also based on a real experience, where once at the Hayward Gallery in London, I met a girl who reminded me very much of an old girlfriend. Her mannerisms were similar, her dress was similar. I didn't know whether I was talking to somebody that I knew really well or somebody that I didn't know at all. And it was extremely hard for me. So eventually I made an excuse and went away. And I sometimes tell people that story, and I say that's what my work is about. You know, some of the drawings, everybody would look at them and they would see a bird, for instance. But it was never a bird. But it's impossible to not see the bird. So in that way, they start to resemble things, and we get to know things even when we know that they're not what we're looking at.
I'm gonna leave the space, keep the microphone, and add whatever you want to the interview.
Okay. It's a very interesting process to add something that I want to say, because like other human beings, I think that art is in service to other things, and what I say is always in service to whoever I'm talking to. So I don't know that there's anything that I want to say that's unsaid, except that if any of you want to know something that hasn't been articulated well, I would want to please you by trying my best to articulate it. If Philippe hadn't left the room, I would be wondering if there's any questions that he wanted to ask that he didn't get to ask. If I could speak to you directly, I would want to know that, because I don't make my work for myself. I make it for you. It is for you. Okay, Philippe.